All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA IAJO speaker session entitled China's Global Media Footprint. And I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Ms. Sarah Cook, for taking the time to present today. So just a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. So during the brief or at the Q&A portion of the brief, feel free to submit your questions through the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has 2 overlapping speech bubbles and 1 as a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before you submit your question, or if you'd prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, feel free to submit your questions anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So I will go ahead then and introduce today's speaker before turning the floor over to her. Ms. Sarah Cook is the Research Director for China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan at Freedom House. She also directs the China Media Bulletin, a monthly digest in English and Chinese, providing news and analysis on media freedom developments related to China. Ms. Cook is also the author of several Asian country reports for Freedom House's annual publications, as well as 4 special reports about China entitled Beijing's Global Megaphone, The Battle for China's Spirit, the Politburo's Predicament, and the Long Shadow of Chinese Censorship. So Ms. Cook, I'll turn the floor over to you now.
Great, and you can hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hi everyone, it's really a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you and to share some of the research that my colleagues and I have been doing with regards to China, and particularly the way in which Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party are influencing news and information around the world. So I thought I'd break down my remarks in a few ways. One, I'll speak very briefly about some of the trends we've seen happening inside China and the trajectory there over the last decade in particular, because I think it does very much connect with what we're seeing happening outside of China. Then I'll speak about some of the toolbox and the ways in which we've kind of disaggregated the different tactics that Chinese Communist Party and related actors are using to influence news and information in different parts of the world. And then I'll talk a little bit about the impact and response that we're seeing, because I think that's also one of the really important trends that has changed quite a bit over the last few years. And then I'm looking forward to our discussion and the questions. So as many of you know, Freedom House is best known for our annual studies that kind of give grades to countries on their level of freedom. And China, since their inception, has obviously been rated not free, and very much so. But actually, if we look at the scores in, say, our Freedom in the World, or that looks at political rights and civil liberties, or freedom on the net, internet freedom, China's gotten really increasingly repressive, and the regime increasingly authoritarian and even totalitarian over the last decade. So just to give you a quick sense of how much it's changed, in 2012, China scored a 17 on Freedom in the World. That's out of 100. So that's a pretty, deep F, you could say. But actually, by the edition we just released a few months ago, China dropped to a 9. So we're talking about a country that was already deeply authoritarian, has become about half as free as it was about a decade ago. So that's one element, and similar shift in scores, I would say, in the internet freedom dimension. But even that doesn't quite capture the kind of qualitative dimensions of all of the different spaces and activities for religious communities, for ethnic minorities, for ordinary Chinese netizens and journalists, of what was permissible speech or what was permissible activity, or tolerated at least, and what is now very, very harshly punished. As well as the kind of creeping influence and tentacles of the Communist Party itself into different parts of Chinese society, including the news and information sector, which again was always there, but has definitely, particularly since structural reforms into March 2018, but even a little bit before that under Xi Jinping, the party is very much present, both in the private sector and in the media sector. And I think that's a really important context when we're looking at what's happening internationally, because in a lot of ways, this increasing assertiveness that we're seeing internationally is very much emerging out of the increasing assertiveness and aggressiveness in suppressing freedom and free speech within China. And I think the other element of it is also the fact that when we see various actors, and this isn't always so easy to pinpoint, but acting in certain ways or seemingly working on behalf of Beijing outside of China, I think that is also a reflection of what's happening inside China in terms of how much more control and pressure really the Chinese Communist Party has, say, on private companies, which I'll get to in a little while. And so Freedom House, what I'll speak about today, the media dimension, is just really, I would say, maybe three parts of the puzzle or these transnational dimensions that we're seeing in terms of the way in which the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarianism at home is influencing events outside and freedoms outside of China. One is through the more kind of the export of surveillance technologies, which we've looked at a bit in Freedom on the Net. The other is through the pursuit and attacks on diaspora and exile communities, be they Chinese democracy activists, people who practice Falun Gong, Tibetans and Uyghurs, Hong Kongers increasingly, through our work on transnational repression, and then this element of the media portion. And so I think, when we're looking at Beijing's growing global media influence, one of the things that's really striking is that no market is too small. There's really something happening almost at every country in the world. Some of the examples in at some of the links I think Nicole had shared or was going to share in the recent reports are from places like Papua New Guinea. It's really small media markets, and we're seeing increasing linguistic diversity. So efforts to actually, share content or information, in some cases disinformation campaigns, social media posts, in languages like Italian or Serbian that are spoken by very, very few people, relatively. But I think one of the things is that, this trend of the increasing media influence, preceded Xi Jinping. It really began under Hu Jintao, and the first kind of bulk of billions of dollars towards enhancing the global reach of Chinese state media really started in 2010, 2011, even 2009 under Hu Jintao. But Xi Jinping has really taken it to another level. And in general, Xi is much savvier when it comes to media and content and social media, for example, relative to his predecessors. And so today, the reality is that hundreds of millions of people around the world and in multiple languages are consuming news that's influenced by Chinese Communist Party narratives and directions, but often without being aware of the party state origins. And so I think that's one of the things when we're looking at kind of the spectrum or the toolbox for how media influence happens. And so the way I've broken it down in my work has really been kind of four categories, four parts of the toolbox. One is propaganda and the promotion of specific content and or net preferred narratives coming from Beijing. And there you've kind of got this spectrum of kind of from what's the most overt and transparent in terms of the original party linkages and through to what is much less transparent. Before I go into that, I'll say kind of the four buckets so you have kind of the general framework. So one is propaganda. One is disinformation campaigns, which is more kind of inauthentic behavior on global social media platforms. The third is censorship. And the fourth, which is again relatively new, is this element of really gaining influence or control over the infrastructural nodes of the information flow in a foreign country. And so I'll kind of go into a bit more detail on each of those pieces of the puzzle. And one of the things I think some of what the Chinese government does in state media is public diplomacy, and it's pretty similar to what a lot of governments, including our own, will do. But I think, the Australians kind of framed it well in saying, and I think this is what I try to look at are the covert, coercive, or corrupting elements and examples. And so I think a lot of these parts of the toolbox have some of those elements in it. So if we're looking at propaganda, on the one hand, yes, part of it is Chinese state media where you're picking up the China Daily, or you're flipping the CGTN, you know exactly what it is. And yeah, okay, you're watching Chinese state media. The reality is that even, in terms of, say, their presence on social media up until recently, and as labels were added, there's a lot of effort to obfuscate that, to obfuscate who they are. And if you look at in the Beijing Global Megaphone report, we kind of put together a little table of, what the publication is and what its tagline is in terms of how it self-defines itself, whether it's in paid inserts that are inserted into local mainstream media in other countries, or in terms of, say, the social media tagline. So the People's Daily, for example, which is the Chinese Communist Party's official mouthpiece, labels itself as like the largest newspaper in China. China Daily, the largest English newspaper in China. Well, it's really the only national English newspaper that's permitted in China, right? And so I think for those who are not aware of what these entities are or how China works and how the media environment in China works, it can be a little bit difficult to specifically know that it's not just publicly funded or government influenced. These are state and party control that are now under the, even structurally under the Communist Party's propaganda department. And we're told by Xi Jinping that they have to be surname party and that, the propaganda and its tentacles have to reach everywhere. I'm paraphrasing him, but it was something along those lines. So I think that's one of the ways in which there's very much obfuscation, even when you're talking about looking directly at content that's labeled as coming from these entities. But then you get into deeper layers of obfuscation in terms of paid ads, because not that many people are going to pick up a copy of the China Daily, but insert it into a mainstream media that people are buying anyway. You get a lot more viewers. The fact that it says paid supplement in the corner, or that just says kind of from China or something like that, doesn't really I would say be fully transparent to readers and news consumers of what this really is. And then you get into elements of, for example, co-productions, content sharing agreements. As Xinhua News, for example, the official news agency, has signed with news agencies in a wide range of countries. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is that this is happening not only in other countries that are, say, rated not free by Freedom House, but also ones that are rated partly free and free. And so this is not something it's not just about, say, the CCP partnering with other authoritarian regimes. It's very much happening in open and democratic societies, including our own, as many of you probably know. So I think there's there's co-productions, there's inserts. There's this element of bringing journalists and trying to co-opt them, and editors too, and people at the management level to try to influence them in terms of their coverage of China. One of the things we're seeing, again, in terms of levels of transparency, is that in some places, there'll be a Xinhua story, but it might not be labeled as such. It might be with like a local Kenyan journalist's name, for example, as the byline, but it's actually a Xinhua article. And so I think that makes it that much harder for news consumers to know where this content is coming from. And that's deliberate, because it's pretty clear that when international news consumers know that this content is coming from the Chinese government, there's clearly a healthy skepticism about that. And so if you look at social media, for example, and this kind of goes maybe to this question of the response, but ever since Twitter added labels, there was one study that looked at the level of engagement with tweets from major Chinese state media accounts and dropped by like a third. So that could be maybe a combination of bots and other trolls that are amplifying their content being taken down, but also the impact of the additional transparency vis-a-vis their content in people's Twitter feeds. So that's kind of the propaganda part of the puzzle. And I think we're seeing more other kinds of things happening, like in terms of, say, purchasing stakes and other kind of often economic and financial transactions that will then translate into, a more kind of pro-Beijing editorial line. Then we get to disinformation. This is really disinformation campaigns, and this is really one of the, I would say, newer tactics that's really emerged since 2017, but we honestly really started noticing or knowing that it was happening in 2018, 2019. It was just when some of the data came out from some of the campaigns, it became evident that this had begun back in 2017. And so this involves, usually it involves some element of inauthentic activity, bot accounts or other kinds of fake accounts and personas increasingly that are posting to global social media sites that are blocked in China, like typically, Facebook and Twitter, and often will use YouTube links as well. And trying to manipulate the conversation. And, there's now been multiple takedowns, of this type of content. And one of the things, and a piece I'd written fairly recently, looking kind of in depth at some of these, is that they are becoming better at this and they are becoming more sophisticated. Because at first it was pretty clunky, especially relative to what Russia is capable of doing. But now we're seeing more persona accounts. We're seeing persona accounts in Spanish. We're seeing these accounts that are able to actually get local media or local social media influencers in Latin America, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, sharing the content and the posts from these accounts. And I think one of the things that's interesting in terms of some of the narratives and maybe a strategic shift, and you've all probably heard about this with all the talk of wolf warrior diplomacy and the like, is that traditionally a big, the main focus for the party's kind of propaganda apparatus was to kind of make China and the regime look good, open to investment, make the regime at home, and to use various forms of leverage, which I'll get to in a second when I talk about censorship, to suppress or marginalize critical voices. But now you've got this other element that's a little bit more offensive, and that also involves, in some cases, making others look bad. So it could be demonizing Hong Kong protesters, Uyghurs, discrediting Uyghur reports of, and scholars who have documented reports of abuse, what's happening in Xinjiang. The United States certainly sharing and amplifying conspiracy theories about the origin of COVID and the like. And then in some cases, actually even more so, kind of efforts to amplify maybe content that's on the margins and that exists in another society, but that amplifies kind of the domestic divisions or alliances, say, between a country like Serbia and the EU, trying to affect perceptions in the United States of Taiwan, things like that, as well as just say, making it seem like there's going to be some kind of nationwide military lockdown around COVID or something like that, and sowing that kind of panic. So I think there's definitely this more offensive element compared to the kind of more defensive stance that we've seen in the past in terms of just, I would say, kind of goals and tactics. I think the other element, like I was saying, category is censorship, and that's where there's some form of intimidate. Some of it's intimidation, some of it's obviously the various restrictions that are placed on, say, foreign journalists, or blocking of websites and the financial implications of that, things that happen inside China, but very much affect what news and information we all have access to outside of China, as well as the financial sustainability of news outlets that are critical of the Chinese Communist Party. But then you've got now, with as part of the wolf warrior diplomacy, it's not just on Twitter, there are various other forms of kind of aggressive intimidation vis-a-vis journalists, or media outlets that are reporting in a way that China doesn't like. But then you get into kind of some of the financial elements. So this question of, like, once stakes are purchased, how is that leverage either by a company or an individual with close ties to the Chinese Communist Party or the regime? How is that leverage then used to suppress certain kinds and engender self-censorship? And sometimes it's preemptively. In another case, it might be that there's someone with, like, kind of an oligarch type or a tycoon who has strong business interests and ties in China, and they purchase or own a media outlet, and they're suppressing coverage themselves because they don't want to accidentally offend Beijing and hurt their other business interests. And then we do see things like some physical attacks and cyber attacks as well. But I think it's really that element of the kind of financial and economic intersection combined with some of the bullying. So you'll see, especially with diaspora Chinese media, pressure on advertisers and businesses not to advertise, businesses in Chinatown. And in general, a lot of these tactics we've seen back in the report I wrote in 2013, The Long Shadow of Chinese Censorship. Most of that was happening primarily among Chinese language media in the diaspora or in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And now we're seeing these very same tactics actually being deployed against local media and local journalists in more and more countries. And then the fourth category is this element of PRC-based companies with close ties to the regime who have received, even if they're technically privately owned, who have received subsidies in one form or another, or have other kind of security ties, a track record of collaborating with surveillance and censorship in China, albeit with, I would say, politicized and religious censorship in China, and I would say, they're also stuck themselves between a rock and a hard place, but it's just becoming harder and harder now, given what I was saying at the beginning about how much more oppressive and authoritarian China's become domestically for private companies and even, big tycoons like people like Jack Ma or Pony Ma, Tencent, to really push back. And so what we're seeing are some of these companies actually really gaining a foothold in just managing content dissemination infrastructure in other countries. And I'll give kind of a couple of examples. One category is digital television. And we've especially seen this in Africa, but when I was starting to dig around a little bit more, I actually found examples in Pakistan, in East Timor, so in parts of Asia, where, as part of this technological transition from analog to digital, Chinese companies have actually innovated and are actually quite good at delivering these services. But alongside expanding access to television content, there's definitely, once they kind of gain that foothold and they're the gatekeepers, there is an element of amplifying sources that are preferable to the Chinese government and making more expensive, for example, sources that are less favorable or that competitors to Chinese state media. So in a number of countries in Africa, the local the most affordable Star Times package, which is the Chinese company that does digital TV transitions, are the local stations as well as Chinese state media. But some of their biggest competitors, like the BBC World, or CNN, or even Al Jazeera, you have to pay 2 to 4 times more to be able to get that in your television package. So that's just kind of one example where you're kind of seeing the infrastructural elements actually translate into having content implications. I think the other social media platforms and various other applications, and WeChat, run by Tencent, is the most stark because it's especially being used in the Chinese diaspora, but actually increasingly, particularly in parts of Asia and places like Mongolia and the Philippines and Thailand and Indonesia. It's actually used by a good proportion. In Myanmar, I think it was being used of the local population. And in WeChat's case, unlike I would say with TikTok, where it's been harder it's a little bit different kind of platform, obviously, and it's been a little bit less clear in terms of the evidence of manipulation. And WeChat's very well documented that there's absolutely surveillance of users and their content. There's systematic screening of content by political keywords, and in some cases, not necessarily deletion, but gathering of it, possibly to apparently help inform what might be the up and coming sensitive keywords they should censor inside China. But in terms of the fact that it's not, say, just metadata that's being watched, but there's actually screening of all of the content by political keywords, that's very clear. And number of cases of politicized censorship of Chinese activists, but also of local politicians trying to use WeChat to communicate with their constituents. And we've seen cases like that in Canada, in the US, and in Australia that have been well documented. And so I think that's a classic situation where you end up with a PRC-based own platform that essentially is the gatekeeper. It's not going to, is this propaganda, is this censorship, is this information? It could be all of it, because they basically are the gatekeepers. They get to decide who can and cannot be on the platform. And honestly, for the Chinese diaspora, it's a real problem and Chinese diaspora media, because media that are critical of the Chinese government, or even a publication like Freedom House's China Media Bulletin, that we publish in Chinese. We haven't tried, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't last very long. And maybe we'll do it as a little bit of an experiment, just so I can say more definitively that we've been censored, but I don't think our account would last very long. And there also might be risks for users to follow us, to be honest, given the level of surveillance of people, including outside of China. So I think that's one example. But I think one of the things we're seeing now is there's a plethora of PRC-owned apps in a variety of different places around the world. News aggregator apps. Apparently in the Middle East, there's an app called Yalla, which is kind of like Clubhouse. It's like audio based. That's a PRC based one. And I think we really just don't know what's happening there. But there have been tidbits. There was a big Reuters investigation about a news aggregator app in Indonesia, for example, that had moderation rules some of it's not necessarily that they're fully censoring. That's where it can be really, really subtle and algorithmic, where it might be just like to downplay, to not recommend content that was critical of Chinese government, that was related to what was happening in Xinjiang, for example, which obviously is a Muslim country. A lot of people in Indonesia might be interested and concerned about. But then I think there was something about like the South China Sea, or even about like, maybe it was about TikTok, and this was a different ByteDance owned app, having trouble in Indonesia with regulators there, and what content was being permitted to be to be shared or to be pushed to users and the like. So I think once you've got a PRC-based company that's, there are very real concerns, that owns an app that's being used widely in another country. There are very real concerns, not just in terms of data access and the surveillance risk. I mean, personally, I think in terms of just freedom and political speech and kind of potential for interference and mischief making, actually the content manipulation is probably more problematic. because one of the things we've seen, and we certainly saw this with COVID, is that, you know, it might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, but at some point when the CCP is kind of in its like survival mode, or there's something that it just really feels very strongly about, it will activate these, and it will activate these avenues. And once they're in, there's really not much you can do about it. So kind of figuring out, I mean, now I'll get to the response, I think, in terms of the right balance in other countries between not blocking these completely, because that's problematic from a different perspective, but finding ways to enhance the transparency and to push companies to play by local rules and so forth, doing audits and things might be the way forward to be able to detect certain kinds of problematic political manipulation that may be happening. So I think in terms of some of the trends that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, I've mentioned a few of them. One is this kind of Russia-style social media disinformation campaigns emanating from China, and an increasing sophistication in terms of the tactics with which those are done. Various types of tactics, be they in terms of, say, purchasing stakes and co-opting owners, or kind of the more aggressive censorship, intimidation type tactics that have been used to really gain control over the last 30 years over Chinese language publications, now being used to promote certain content or suppress coverage in local languages. This element of kind of Beijing and closed companies gaining influence over crucial parts of other countries' information infrastructure, and some of that control actually being used in certain cases, you know, for politicized content manipulation in favor of pro-Beijing narratives or goals. So having said all of that, what's the actual impact? I would say it's mixed. I mean, I think in terms of public opinion, and this has shifted back and forth during COVID, and as well as I would say just over time, you know, there's ups and downs, and it very much, I think, can depend also geographically if we're talking about places like the US or Europe or Australia versus perhaps the global South. I mean, on the one hand, when you look at some of the data on public opinion surrounding the first years of the global state media expansion up until around 2015 or 2016, definitely views of China and of Xi Jinping personally were improving. But if you look at the last 5 years, especially the last 3 years, there's been quite a decline. You know, again, actually a reflection probably of the actual harsher approach that China and the Chinese Communist Party has taken in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong, and that really undermining their reputation in other parts of the world as that information has come out. But even in one survey that was done about like this question of where COVID originated, it was pretty overwhelming, including in places like Nigeria and South Africa. So this isn't just necessarily in the US or UK or France, that large proportions, like 70–80%, said, nope, it originated in China. And this is despite all of the effort that was made in terms of disinformation campaigns, in terms of state media spokespeople and so forth, you know, to spread these conspiracy theories that originated in the US and the US military brought it to China. But I think that being said, there are a number of different ways in which when we look at how the actions actually operate, that there's real world impact that is very problematic in the sense of whether there's a lack of transparency in some of these deals and things like that, you know, surrounding, say, content sharing agreements, whether the financial implications for disfavored outlets and the ability for them to reach audiences. And in some cases, if China is able to get actually local governments or local officials to take action, legal action against critical media or disfavored media. There was a case in Thailand of a man who was helping, a Taiwanese man who was helping broadcast uncensored content critical of the Chinese government into China, and the Thai police arrested him basically after legal proceedings. He was basically sent back. He was found guilty, but sent back to Taiwan. But I think those kinds of situations raise also real questions about the degree of, you know, whether it's sovereignty or rule of law development in different countries and the role that China and the Communist Party are playing there. I think the point I'd end on is, because I want to make sure we have time for questions, is the other trend is the shifting tide. Is that 4 or 5 years ago when I started talking about this, people are like, yeah, I don't know, is this really a thing? Is this really a problem? And I think there's very much an awareness that actually, yes, it is. Yes, this is happening. Yes, it's very much a problem. And we should be finding ways to respond to it. And so we see a number of different, whether it's governmental actors and legislative initiative, both in the US as well as in places like Australia. We see regulatory decisions happening in places like the UK and in Taiwan. We're seeing on the non-governmental side more exposure and analysis of disinformation campaigns, efforts by the technology sector, both to enhance transparency through actions like labeling, for example, but also in terms of detecting and taking down some of these inauthentic campaigns and actually giving access to researchers to the data so that they can analyze it and identify trends and things like that. And in the media and civil society sector, where we're seeing, newspapers discontinue paid ads. We're seeing investigative journalism into the actual ways in which the Chinese government or Communist Party are influencing media locally. We're seeing various kind of think tank initiatives and so forth, really identifying and following what's been happening. And there have been some successes. I mean, if you look at Taiwan is actually a really important and interesting example. And, if we're talking even just in the disinformation space, in 2018 and late 2018, they were pretty kind of caught a bit flat-footed, I think, in the November local elections in terms of the type of disinformation and manipulation on social media there, not only Facebook and Twitter, but also through Line, the Japanese kind of more closed circuit messaging platform, more like WhatsApp. I think the sense is that it did help influence the elections in a pretty important election in southern Taiwan. But then ahead of the January 2020 general elections, there was a real cross-sector effort in terms of the government, civil society, and tech companies to really be on the watch and to respond quickly and enhance media literacy and fact check information and point out when there's problematic information. And it really seemed like there was definitely a campaign coming from China to try to influence people's voting and perceptions of Tsai Ing-wen in particular, and manipulate kind of the electoral outcome there that failed. So I think that's just one kind of example of the type of pushback that we've seen. But I think one of the things, this is what I wrote in the NED paper that was more focused per their request on the civil society sector, is that it's still a little bit fragmented. And I think this element of, and of course, China isn't the only actor, it's just the CCP, there's so much money and so much activity. And as I said, it truly is a global phenomenon where no market is too small. There's still a lot of spaces to kind of mainstream the CCP factor. And so if you look at like this general kind of media development, media literacy programs, there might be a lot of journalist training programs funded by, say, like USAID or DRL, opportunities to kind of incorporate into a broader unit on X, Y, and Z, including maybe on foreign influence or information about, okay, like these are actually Chinese state media, and this is what it means to be a Chinese state media, and these are ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and these are the examples of some of the things that we've seen them do elsewhere that they might be doing or are likely to be doing in your country. That I think a lot of people would instinctively find to be problematic. So I think there's definitely been better pushback. There's definitely more room for kind of lessons learned and best practices, including in terms of balancing, how do you limit some of this influence and insulate and protect and enhance resilience against it, but also be mindful of proportionality and necessity and other principles that we would want to use in a democratic society in terms of respecting people's, right to privacy or private businesses, competition or certainly free speech if we're talking, say, about whether we restrict apps or certain media and access to information. So I'll stop there.
All right, thanks so much, Ms. Cook. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. Oh, I'm getting a bit of echo.
Oh,
there we go. All right. So we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. And we will start with the most liked question, which is currently posed by Jim Kruppe. And he wants to hear more about Chinese operations through their social media. So the question is, the Chinese are social, sorry, the question went away. The Chinese are long-term strategic thinkers. What are they doing to reach kids in the US through gaming and social media, TikTok, et cetera, in the context of psychological manipulation?
Well, that's a good question that I don't really have a good answer for right now. I haven't looked that deeply at the US. One thing I will say is that we are just starting a project now called that's kind of an expansion on the Beijing Global Megaphone, which is using this kind of framework I outlined of both a toolbox, but looking at resilience too, to do a collection of 30 in-depth country case studies. And one of them will be the US. So I might have a better answer for you on this in about a year. I mean, what I would say is that I think in some cases with apps and the like TikTok, or there's like a news aggregator app, I think there is some combination of kind of the commercial incentives and Chinese companies that are pretty innovative and that are trying to reach global audiences, as well as the kind of Chinese government, go global directive to Chinese state media and Chinese companies. I mean, again, I think in the case of TikTok, and I haven't really spent a lot of time on the platform myself, to be honest, but from people who I've seen who have, it seems like, and this has happened a few places. I mean, it seems like at some point there were maybe moderation rules that were much more clearly censorious and restrictive that then were kind of exposed. And then they're like, well, so it seems like there is a good amount of kind of content that certainly doesn't appear on the Chinese version, Douyin, of TikTok in China, but that you would expect the Chinese government really wouldn't like. I think in terms of this question of like, what kind of content might be pushed or manipulated, that's again where we just don't really know. And I think it's the same thing with WeChat. And I think that's the thing where with some of these platforms, they don't necessarily have like requiring transparency reports, for example, right? I mean, they don't have transparency reports. And so there's a lot of, we don't know whether, if the kind, first of all, are there the kind of inauthentic activity accounts that somebody from China is doing on their platforms, even with the company not knowing, or maybe the company's turning a blind eye to it? We just don't really know. It's just so much more opaque than what we're able to find out, with all of their, still battling this on platforms like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. So it's just really hard to know. And so then it becomes very sporadic. So I think that is one of those questions where, if we're thinking about what is the potential role for some kind of government regulation, I think at the very least certain kinds of transparency requirements for any company. But I think those are the kinds of things that we see US-based or European-based companies doing on their own. And I think with companies, whether they're Russian companies or Chinese companies and apps, that you're just going to have to force them to do that. You're just going to have to require it, and then you're going to have to audit it and find some way of auditing it to make sure that it's true. And then you're going to have it be something periodic, like every year, because I think that's the only way that you're really actually going to get a good answer and have some kind of deterrent in terms of them keeping their platforms clean, so to speak, from some of that. So yeah, but I'm maybe in a year from now I'll have a better answer in terms of specific examples that might come up of potentially problematic content or manipulation happening. But again, I think it's also one of those things where it can be very subtle, so some of it might not be so clear, if there's an element of kind of amplifying kind of partisanship and divisions, just because like that makes the US weaker. That would be much harder to detect, I would say, unless there's some kind of inauthentic activity or behavior behind it being used to do that. As opposed to if like there's no information about Tibet on the platform, right? Like then it's obviously much more clear.
So building on your remarks about transparency and regulation, we also have a question from Martin Correll, who asks if you know what organizations the CCP is using to obfuscate their financing into the US media landscape, and how can policymakers improve legislation to mitigate the effects of CCP influence in today's US media market, as far appears to be lacking?
So that's a good question. Well, I think there have been a few different tactics that they've tried, but they don't always run. And there's actually some new FCC rules that actually require much more transparency. So I think there has been some movement on this. I mean, some things, and again, this is where it can get tricky, where there'll be a local, actually U.S. citizen, but who's ethnic Chinese, or maybe sometimes maybe not, you know, who has some kind of ties to China and purchases some radio station or something like that, and then it turns out that there's China Radio International being broadcast on it, for example, right? So there's some things like that that just might be kind of tricky. I think that's where the new FCC rules, as I understand them, are basically a requirement for any outlet that is transmitting China, foreign government state content. So it's not just China, it applies to China, it would apply to Russia, it would apply to Iran as well, to inform consumers. Not only in writing, but say on radio or television at the beginning, at the end of each segment, or something along those lines. That this is content, you know, that is coming from a foreign state source. So I think that's actually a really good approach, because it basically, you know, one of the things that's really hard is this way of like, you know, how do you track all of this and, you know, behind the scenes, right? And who owns this and who are they? And it's not always so clear. And that, honestly, I think from some conversations we've had with folks at DOJ, especially when you have limited staff and limited Chinese language capability, can be kind of difficult, especially when you're looking at the Chinese language market, for example, but even not, to be able to know, oh, so-and-so went to there and they went to that training and they have this ties, and this newspaper is actually owned by so-and-so, is connected to that person. So I think just the idea of kind of putting the burden on, you know, the publisher of the content. Of course, then again, you got to audit and enforce it. But I think those kinds of rules, I think that's actually was quite a good move. I think with FARA, we've seen better enforcement. I mean, I think there's actually still a lot of room in terms of FARA enforcement. But one of the things we've actually seen is that they've pushed China. First of all, they pushed CGTN and Xinhua to register. Then they pushed China Daily to be much more transparent. And so I had actually gone through for the Beijing's Global Megaphone, about 10 years of FARA filings from China Daily. And it was interesting because actually, as the amount of money that they were getting from China or spending in the US increased, the level of transparency went down. So initially they had like really itemized expenditures, but then probably around when they started actually paying local US media to put inserts, they started just like putting the line item and maybe kind of some vague thing about, oh, we sent to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal or whatever. And but I think they must have written a letter from the DOJ and pushed them to file more transparently, because all of a sudden there were some reports about, oh, they paid this outlet this and this outlet that. And lo and behold, just around that time, that's when the Washington Post and the New York Times both discontinued their inserts. And I think it was probably a combination of that and a combination of everything happening with both Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and COVID that I think probably made some of the content that they were pushing through these China Watch supplements a bit less palatable to editors, or even maybe the business side of some of these major newspapers. So I think there is actually better FARA enforcement happening now. I think there definitely could be more, especially in the Chinese language market. And I think that's important because, and I don't know enough. I haven't looked, and I don't know anybody who has actually, but maybe we'll be able to dig this up as we do our case study, or like the finances of it. Because, like, for example, you know, in some cases they're getting some subsidies, but in other cases, like maybe there are local American businesses who are advertising in these Chinese language newspapers because they tout themselves. I mean, the circulation numbers for Chinese, I mean, I think ethnic minority media in general in a lot of countries is, you know, it's not as well documented and audited as it is for kind of mainstream media. It's pretty fishy in the Chinese. So if they're going to like American businesses and are saying like, hey, you know, we're like the most widely read Chinese newspaper in America, and in fact, it's like the China Press, which is like half of it is Xinhua News, right? And it's like it's very problematic. I mean, they're not registered under FARA. So if they were actually registered under FARA, maybe that would be a way for, you know, assuming that they check all the boxes, you know, that you know, local American businesses would at least know that before they would decide to advertise with them. So I think there have been both on the FCC and from the DOJ side and FARA some moves in the right direction, I would say, even just over the last 2 years.
All right, thank you, Ms. Cook. For this next question, I'm going to combine two, both from Robert McCreight from George Mason University. And the questions are, given the 4 areas of CCP influence you've noted, what is your estimate of the inroads in which China has already attained in the US media market and educational system? And he also asks, can you comment specifically on CCP influence in US universities, big tech, TV, radio, or social media firms since 2007? So big questions.
Wow, that is a big question. Well, I think my short answer would be, I think the kind of economic dependence and leverage and the activation of that leverage, or even the threat of potential economic harm, is definitely something that we see working. I would say in Hollywood, like what you saw recently with the apology video that the fellow from John Cena, I think, right, did, apologizing for saying Taiwan is a country. I think there's just, you know, there are the economic dimensions of it in terms of the size of the Chinese market for, say, Hollywood. I mean, I think what's interesting with some of the tech companies is yet they've been, I think we might actually be lucky that like Twitter and Facebook are cut out of China, because China has 3 times the number of internet users than the US. So if they were there, can you imagine how beholden to the Chinese Communist Party they would be? I mean, I don't know. Would those companies be taking down? I mean, it might be a very different ballgame in terms of what, you know, people could say if you had companies that were running these kinds of platforms and actually did have access to the Chinese market and were in some way or another really worried about losing their biggest market by being blocked suddenly. So I think there are some pluses. I think the other thing I would say, I mean, there's been a huge pushback with the Confucius Institutes and the presence at universities, so that's significantly reduced. I think one area of concern I have, and I've been itching to do a research project on it, and I haven't had the time or the funds, to be honest, are Confucius classrooms. And I'm the mother of a 6-year-old who's learning Chinese, not at a Confucius classrooms, but Confucius classrooms are the K-12 version of Confucius Institutes, and there are actually more of them than Confucius Institutes. When I looked a couple of years ago, there were about 500 in about 47 states around the US. And I think you have a situation there where it's even more localized, where school districts are even less well equipped than than universities to kind of manage these complexities and know the potential challenges, and where there's been a real partnering between, say, like there's some of these advisory committees I've seen where it's like the head of the Foreign Language Association or somebody from them with someone from the Chinese embassy or Chinese consulate. Like, actually, when you're talking about the K-12 level, the influence that China has over Chinese language education in the United States is actually much greater than it is at the university level. Because for all of the issues surrounding Confucius Institutes, I mean, I think there's only so much they actually teach classes for credit, and they're, and so forth. And but I think actually in the lower level educational system, and we're talking about like immersion programs in kindergartens in Arizona. I remember that was when I was like, what? Now, that being said, there hasn't been that much research, what art is being done, is this like indoctrination? I mean, I think it's much more subtle than that, and clearly a lot of kids are probably having the opportunity to learn Chinese. But I think it is also one of these things of what's not being said, right? And how would somebody who is, whether they're Taiwanese or from Hong Kong, or a Chinese person who is in exile and is critical of the Chinese government and has the independence and doesn't have to worry about, who's paying them or who's supervising them, from Hanban, monitoring them and punishing them, looking over their shoulders. So I think actually Confucius classrooms, I think they've actually maybe, at least as of a couple of years ago, and I kind of dabbled in this, it was flying below the radar, and I think they'd actually achieved much more inroads there, even more so than at the university level, where also we've seen a lot more exposure and backlash and just alternatives in a lot of places still to like how you would learn Chinese, or additional courses you could take on like what's happening in terms of human rights, or the real history of the CCP, or things like that at a university than you would get in a K-12 setting.
All right, thank you, Ms. Cook. So this next question is our currently most liked question, and it's from D. Phillips from DITRA. And the question is, how do you see the current investigation into the origin of COVID-19 playing out in the media, and how will the CCP influence that?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting in the sense that I think one of the things that got real folded up in all of this is that, and to the CCP's benefit, not that then they were necessarily manipulating it behind the scenes, is the partisan media environment, where when you had Trump administration officials saying that there might be intelligence along these lines, or this is what we think. And of course, it was earlier in terms of like what information was available, also in terms of the alternative theory of, you know, whether this came through a natural evolution. But I think there was a, well, if the Trump administration is saying this, well, then it can't be true, right? And so I think there were a lot of news outlets that were just really skeptical of it, just simply because of who within the US was saying it. And I think with the transition to the current administration, you know, I think there's just a bit, as well as I think the people who are on the other side of the debate of saying, well, this evolved naturally, there hasn't been very strong, you know, as I understand, I mean, not being a virologist, you know, as strong evidence that has come out to support exactly how that evolution happened, that it's getting a second look now. I mean, I think the Chinese government and the Communist Party are very not happy about this. I mean, I think it might be interesting depending on, you know, if there's any kind of backlash that they take. I mean, punitive backlash vis-a-vis certain news outlets or journalists who push on this. I think there is a sense of, look, also, I think that it's a reflection of the broader influence that this China and the CCP have at the World Health Organization in terms of, and we've seen this like from the earliest stages when like Taiwan was trying to warn about human-to-human transmission, and the WHO basically ignored them. So, so I think there's like in terms of that element of, you know, why is this conversation only happening now and why wasn't this taken seriously earlier? I think there's also that element if we're talking about kind of the Chinese influence. I think, look, in terms of what they might do, I mean, I think this kind of element of like peddling the conspiracy theories of alternative origins, including surrounding us, like they put a lot of time and effort into that. Like it was all over. I mean, I remember watching one video, and I don't remember if she was speaking Arabic or if it was dubbed, but there was definitely like a CGTN Arabic video of a young Chinese woman basically explaining all about how this actually came from the US and from and like, or maybe we don't really know, but like, did it really come from China, or maybe it came from here, or maybe it came from there, we just don't really know. So this element of kind of like muddying the waters. And I think again, this element of kind of pushing that, you know, not necessarily so much to audiences say here in the US, but say to audiences in the global South that might themselves already be a little more skeptical of the US or have strong anti-US sentiment, and this kind of fueling that or fitting that narrative at the same time that China's providing them with vaccines. So like it does seem like this International Federation of Journalists did a report recently about a survey, I think it was taken in January or something like that, about the kind of perceptions and like the media influence. And there was one chart that caught me particularly. I don't remember the specific stats. I mean, you can look it up. It just came out very recently, which was like the countries where China was providing the vaccine and like what the coverage was like just generally. I think I don't know if it was also on the origins of COVID, but just, or about just China. And then the countries that were not receiving like a China-based vaccine. And it was very clear. I mean, they didn't do like regression analysis, but like the correlation was very strong. So I think the vaccine provision, even more than some of the mass diplomacy, I think might really benefit, maybe legitimately so, you know, China's reputation and ability to, you know, have the kind of local reporting about it, even surrounding COVID, that they would like. As well as, I think part of it was also this question of whether elites feel beholden to China and they want to use their own. Because one of the things you see, especially in countries that are less free, where either because it's a state-run media itself or other control that the local government has over the media, even in places like Serbia, you know, that they exercise that influence themselves over the news environment in favor of China, because they're favorable to the CCP and the leadership in Beijing. So I think that's also a question where, like, if there's a country where they're getting vaccines from China and they're also kind of controlling certain media, do they want to really risk upsetting, you know, and jeopardizing that vaccine, you know, shipment, you know, by talking up too much this question of whether it leaked from a lab. So I think there is some intersection there.
All right, thank you, Ms. Cook. And so we do have a soft stop at 2 o'clock today, but thank you everyone for submitting all of your questions. I'm going to say we have time to tackle about 2 more, but if your question hasn't been addressed today and you would like Ms. Cook to address it after the session, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is npeterson@nsiteam.com, and I can forward it over to Ms. Cook. All right, so this first question is concerning the content that we're seeing in other languages. How much attention has been paid to the narratives of messaging? Specifically, does it appear that the content is more China contributing to the narrative in that country or trying to push its own narratives in those countries? Additionally, does it appear that Chinese posters are fluent in the other languages, i.e. the content uses idioms from that language? Or does it appear that they are currently using machine translations of Chinese, i.e. Chinese idioms are used and not translated well into other languages? Oh, and you're on mute.
Very good questions. I do not have a good answer for that right now. Again, I actually think in a year I'll have a better answer for that because we are actually going to be working with local analysts in 30 countries around the world to look at some of these questions. I can say, I think some cases it's machine translation, some cases it might just be like, you know, a non-native speaker. I mean, I think in Chinese, you kind of see that with some of the Taiwanese stuff where they've gotten better at it, where they would like use traditional characters, or I remember there was one, like it was actually an English one in the US trying to make it seem like Taiwanese netizens were supporting California's independence or secession or something like that. And there was something they said, I can't remember the phrasing, and it was like so obvious that it was a mainland Chinese person. And I think this was actually in English. So I think there's definitely kind of like slip ups and things like that. But again, in terms of looking at some of the reposting of, say, some of the Spanish language content or things like that. I mean, in that case, it was someone with a Chinese persona, but who was kind of pretending to be a real person and, you know, but was part of this network where works specifically on like, you know, Chinese office hours and takes off holidays and things like that. That you know, people saw as being authentic and genuine. So, and got, you know, retweets by like Venezuelan ministers and like a former CNN anchor or something like in Latin America. So you might not necessarily, if they're disguising, if they're pretending to be kind of ordinary Chinese, there might be some leeway there in terms of the extent to which they would, you know, users might interact with them and expect them to have that idiomatic element. I'll just say real quick, you're welcome to also email me directly. My email is cook, C-O-O-K, @freedomhouse.org. And also a lot of these types of things we cover in the China Media Bulletin, which is kind of a newsletter of analysis and kind of a news digest that, you know, we publish about 9 times a year. We just did the June issue. We're going to do the May issue. We're going to do the June issue in a couple of weeks. We have a whole Beyond China section, and I think that's where, like, for example, we covered this recent FCC move, but we cover, you know, what's happening both inside China and outside of China. And so you can just look that up on our website, or you can also just email cmb@freedomhouse.org, and it's free, so we're happy to add folks to the list. Sorry, just wanted to squeeze that in before I forgot and we did the last question.
Oh yeah, of course, and thank you. We had a few messages in the Q&A asking how people can stay up to date with your work. So thank you for the plug. All right, so I will wrap up then with our currently most liked question with 8 likes. So this question is, are we seeing a focus of information operations encapsulating the One Belt, One Road initiative globally? And if so, has anyone mapped it geospatially?
I don't know of that. I mean, you know, a lot of the content isn't necessarily, again, it's more the Belt and Road is usually more in terms of like promoting a good image of China type of thing, as opposed to necessarily, I would say, kind of sowing disinformation. So I think usually the disinformation narratives is more when they're trying to spread kind of more malicious or slanderous information about others. But you do see inauthentic networks, I mean, just promoting like, you know, Xi Jinping's latest speech and things like that, just to try to amplify some of this content. I haven't, and this again is something we might come across more in the like individual country case studies. I haven't necessarily seen analysis of like let's say with regards to a particular BRI project in a particular country that say becomes controversial, and the way in which some of these kinds of media or information manipulation tactics might emerge there to try to influence the local debate. I haven't seen anything indicating that, but that doesn't mean it's not happening, and we might get more answers, you know, as we do this project.
All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Cook, for your time today. Again, if anyone has any remaining questions, you can either email Ms. Cook directly or email me and I'll forward them to her. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. And thank you, Ms. Sarah Cook, for taking the time to present today.
Sure.
So have a great day, everyone.